Okay, let's unpack this. We are launching into a deep dive today that tackles a question analysts rarely ask, but I think everyone is feeling. Why does the world feel like it's spinning out of control right now? It's not just that conflicts exist, it's that the rules governing conflict and even the global framework for peace seem to be dissolving all at once.
That sense of accelerated deterioration is exactly what these security reports are documenting. The global security environment isn't just volatile. I mean, it's entering a phase of rapid fragmentation. We're seeing a sharp rise in great power maneuvering, which is fueling localized conflicts in multiple theaters, from, the Southern Caribbean all the way to the South China Sea.
Right. And the fact that they're all happening at once, the simultaneity of it all.
Exactly. The interconnected nature of these crises, Ukraine, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, that's what makes this moment so profoundly unstable for global security experts.
So our mission today is to synthesize a stack of intense, heavy reports that collectively map this global flux. We're pulling the most critical nuggets of insight from the International Crisis Group's annual conflict analysis, the Council on Foreign Relations Preventive Priorities Survey, and strategic documents from major defense and security institutions. We're talking the U.S. Department of Defense, Brookings, Chatham House, and the French Secretary General for Defense and National Security, or SGDSN.
Our goal is pretty straightforward. We want to give you a shortcut to understanding what security experts are most anxious about right now. These sources, they collectively paint a picture of the decay of post-World War II institutions, the return of spheres of influence politics, and critically, the internal contradictions of the new U.S. foreign policy doctrine that is driving so much of this reordering.
And speaking of that doctrine, the new U.S. National Security Strategy, the NSS 2025, is where we have to begin. It's not just a change in priorities. It feels like a change in philosophy. One analysis describes it as being pragmatic without being pragmatist, a fascinating, almost philosophical starting point for understanding how Washington intends to navigate this dangerous world.
It really is. If you dive into the NSS, the core identity is immediately explicit: America first. And this isn't just a political slogan, it's being used as an operational framework. The strategy is fundamentally aimed at prioritizing core national objectives and, crucially, shedding what it calls forever global burdens. It just views these prolonged engagements as strategic liabilities.
Okay, I want to focus on that specific terminology you mentioned, pragmatic without being pragmatist. That sounds like political semantics, but the sources treat it as a genuine shift. So what does that subtle philosophical difference mean in practice?
Well, it's the administration attempting to claim the high ground of being action-oriented without being bound by what they see as the intellectual constraints of the traditional foreign policy establishment. The pragmatists or realists of the past.
So they're trying to have it both ways.
In a sense, the strategy is defined in the reports as muscular without being hawkish and realistic without being realist. In essence, it claims to be non-ideological, driven only by what works for America right now. And that's without necessarily factoring in long-term global stability or, frankly, institutional loyalty. They're claiming a kind of transactional, self-interested practicality.
And that focus on self-interest immediately translates into a massive pivot in attention and resources. I mean, the geography of the NSS is just so revealing. We see a stark emphasis placed specifically on the Western Hemisphere and overwhelmingly on China.
That's where the raw data tells the story. If you just compare the length of the strategy sections, the NSS devotes more paragraphs to Asia, 25 paragraphs, than to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa combined. And that total is only 23. So this is a clear, written mandate for where energy and resources must be focused. It signals a massive retreat from the traditional theaters of American engagement.
And that geographic pivot is entirely underpinned by an explicit framework of economic statecraft. Foreign policy under this doctrine is framed around very traditional economic objectives. It's not about spreading democracy or human rights. It's about dollars and cents and strategic advantage.
Correct. The core drivers are preserving secure supply chains, protecting export markets, and ensuring U.S. technology dominance in critical sectors like AI and computing. And the most immediate pressing example of this economic framing and a massive strategic vulnerability is the reliance on raw materials, specifically critical minerals.
Yeah, the sources stress that dependence isn't just high, it's existential in some areas.
Absolutely. The U.S. is 100% import dependent for 12 critical minerals. That means zero domestic production, zero. And it's over 50% dependent for 28 others. This dependency is not an afterthought. It is a primary strategic driver of the NSS. It's shaping everything from trade negotiations to where the U.S. chooses to engage militarily, especially in resource-rich but unstable regions like Africa and Latin America.
So international assistance, then, which has traditionally been viewed through a mix of humanitarian and strategic lenses, now it's just purely transactional.
That's the explicit instruction. International assistance is justified solely by advancing clearly defined U.S. interests. If it doesn't demonstrably benefit American farmers or secure a supply chain or promote stability that directly leads to American prosperity, it's viewed as a global burden to be avoided. It formalizes what many observers in the Global South have long suspected about the true nature of foreign aid, but this time, Washington is just saying it out loud.
But despite this focus on national interest in avoiding burdens, the NSS is touting the president as the president of peace. That's a phrase used repeatedly in the strategy itself. Yet, the document is just rife with contradictory actions that seem to fly in the face of international law and previous norms. Let's interrogate that contradiction.
The dissonance is jarring. While the rhetoric is focused on peace and avoiding intervention, the administration has ordered what the sources explicitly label as illegal and unnecessary military operations against civilian drug traffickers in the Caribbean. And perhaps even more provocatively, Washington has been openly toying with launching a regime change campaign in Venezuela. This is the muscular side of the strategy, operating without the traditional constraints of, international legal oversight or even congressional authorization.
Wait, so the sources are pointing out that the administration repeatedly emphasizes sovereignty, which is the absolute foundation of the post-WWII legal order, while simultaneously doing two highly damaging things that undermine it globally.
That's the core paradox. First, the administration appears eager to reward Russia for brutally violating Ukraine's sovereignty, effectively endorsing a land grab. Second, Washington is threatening territorial conquest itself, citing places like Greenland and Panama. This is not just hypocrisy, which, let's be honest, previous administrations were often guilty of. This is express revisionism.
Okay, let's pause on that term, express revisionism. Why do analysts see that as so much more dangerous than the familiar hypocrisy we've seen historically?
Because previous administrations, while often self-serving, they played a complicated game. They might violate a norm, but they still publicly affirmed the existence of the norm. They were playing chess with the rulebook nearby, even if they sometimes cheated. This new revisionism, however, is like throwing the rulebook out entirely and daring everyone else to pick up the pieces. When the U.S., which was the primary architect and guarantor of the post-WWII system, starts threatening territorial conquest, it risks normalizing the idea that war is an acceptable way for powerful states to get what they want. It's seen as a green light for adventurism for every other power with territorial ambitions.
And yet, despite these risks and contradictions, the sources also concede that this administration does manage to achieve results in some areas, mostly due to its sheer unorthodoxy. The question is, are these assets or are they high-risk gambles?
The sources term the unorthodoxy an asset because it allows for rapid, high-risk diplomatic maneuvers that can bypass years of bureaucracy. For example, it's hard to imagine any traditional U.S. leader meeting Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, who was still a U.S.-designated terrorist, and then quickly offering vital sanctions relief to stabilize the country. Because the envoys often have direct lines to the president, sometimes being friends or kin, they can act fast and take risks without being tied down by interagency review or traditional diplomatic process.
But if the goal is durable peace, that speed sounds like a major liability.
Yeah.
I mean, if you rush a deal to claim a quick win, what's left behind?
Precisely. The flip side is a constant hunger for short-term fixes. The reports cite framework deals in places like Gaza, the Great Lakes region, specifically Congo-Rwanda, and between Cambodia and Thailand. These are at best temporary ceasefires that leave the core existential disputes entirely unresolved. The administration gets a headline, but the hard work of building institutions and settling disputes is simply relegated to others.
And the danger is that these quick fixes are already proving incredibly fragile. I mean, let's look at Gaza. That ceasefire, months old, is holding in name only.
That ceasefire is considered extremely tenuous. The situation is humanitarianly horrific. Israel has killed roughly 400 Palestinians since the truce began, and the population is crowded in horrendous conditions under continued Hamas rule in less than half the Strip. Analysts universally agree this is defensible only as a way station to something better. It's an unsustainable status quo, and it demonstrates how these quick deals often create a ticking clock rather than a real solution.
And this lack of durability is compounded by a profound lack of follow-through. It's not just the speed of the deal, it's the lack of patience afterward to enforce it.
That's a critical point. The administration has shown it's unwilling to use its full leverage, for example, with Israel, to enforce stability. And crucially, the NSS administration largely abhors cooperation with the UN or other multilateral bodies, which means it cuts funding for peacekeepers and multilateral enforcement mechanisms. This lack of infrastructure means that when the U.S. moves on to the next deal, there's no reliable global architecture to pick up the slack. And belligerents know this. They can sense the global flux, which makes them unwilling to make lasting compromises when they suspect the geopolitical winds might just change again soon.
Okay, so that brings us to the actual flashpoints. What's fascinating here is how the NSS pivot toward the Western Hemisphere, which is the co-equal focus alongside China, translates directly into a high-risk conflict scenario.
It does. For the first time in the CFR Preventive Priorities Survey, Venezuela has ranked as a Tier I threat to U.S. national security and international stability.
And this is far beyond simple sanctions. This is backed by serious military action starting in late 2025.
That's right. The U.S. commenced its biggest military buildup in the southern Caribbean in decades, culminating in the deployment of the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. Furthermore, the U.S. Coast Guard began seizing tankers exporting sanctioned Venezuelan crude, effectively establishing what most observers describe as a clear, if undeclared, naval blockade in the region.
What's crucial here is the shift in justification. The policy goal is no longer framed as restoring Venezuelan democracy, which, as you noted, might not appeal to the America First base.
The justification has shifted to fighting drug trafficking. President Nicolas Maduro is being labeled a narco-terrorist to justify the military pressure. The narrative is framed around domestic U.S. security stopping drugs from coming north.
But the sources are quick to inject nuance regarding that alleged drug threat, preventing a sort of simplistic connection.
Exactly. Analysts confirm that while some top Venezuelan officials do profit from cocaine transiting the country toward Europe and the U.S., none of the fentanyl that is ravaging U.S. communities comes from Venezuela. So the justification of curbing drug trafficking is, therefore, a strategic framing designed to fit the NSS's America First security agenda rather than reflecting the primary source of the fentanyl crisis.
So if the goal isn't necessarily military invasion, what are the possible end games experts see playing out here?
Well, a full-scale Iraq-style invasion is deemed unlikely. Figures close to the president have vocally opposed it due to the predicted cost. However, targeted military action remains highly possible. Things like attacks on military installations, clandestine airstrips used for transit, or continued aggressive interdiction of oil tankers, increasing that blockade pressure.
And what about the transactional off-ramps, that classic high-stakes deal-making that defines this administration's diplomacy?
Maduro, realizing the threat is existential, has reportedly offered the U.S. a major stake in Venezuelan oil reserves as a potential off-ramp. Some analysts suggest that the administration might accept a big chunk of Venezuela's vast oil reserves as a way of claiming a major economic win and declaring mission accomplished, and that would bypass the need for Maduro's political departure entirely. The other possibility is Maduro seeking guaranteed safe exile in a friendly nation like Russia, Turkey, or a Gulf state.
But the risks of forced overthrow or internal chaos are extraordinarily high, right? What stands in the way of a quick military solution?
Analysts warn that military action is highly likely to trigger severe and protracted chaos. The conflict wouldn't simply end with Maduro's removal. You would see immediate factional infighting within the military, which is already divided. And crucially, resistance would come from several organized groups. We have the loyalist military factions, the well-drilled colectivos. These are heavily armed, politically loyal civilian groups designed for urban combat and citizen militias. Plus, the Colombian rebel group National Liberation Army, the ELN, has committed to turning their fire on any foreign forces that arrive. This would trigger further massive refugee flows, and a quarter of the population are already refugees, and a protracted, messy, low-intensity conflict.
That brings us across the Atlantic to Ukraine, which remains a Tier I priority despite the administration's stated focus elsewhere. And it's a place where Europe is confronting a profoundly crumbling security order.
The peacemaking process there is just. It's defined by a flawed stalemate, often poisoned by politics. U.S. envoys like Steve Witkoff continue shuttle talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin, but the process is stained by confusion and politically motivated leaks. The predictable pattern is a draft deal leaks that leans Russia's way, which generates deep suspicion in Kyiv and European capitals. And then U.S. diplomats try to present a more balanced alternative, which Putin then tends to reject.
What are the main points of contention that keep this war grinding on?
Kiev has, very reluctantly, agreed to a basic structure. A ceasefire along the current front lines, accepting de facto Russian control of the current occupied territory, followed by negotiations on a final status. But the devil is in Putin's demands. He demands irreversible Ukrainian concessions in exchange for a truce, specifically demanding complete neutrality and deep demilitarization that many experts fear would not safeguard Ukraine's long-term sovereignty. It would leave it vulnerable to future aggression.
I have to stop you there. The human cost underpinning this stalemate is immense. The casualty numbers cited in the reports are truly staggering, and we can't just move past them clinically.
That is absolutely necessary context. The conflict is ongoing, and the sources stress the massive, almost unimaginable human toll. We're talking upwards of 1 million Russian casualties, that's killed and seriously wounded, and 400,000 to 500,000 Ukrainian casualties. The sheer scope of this loss is why, despite the diplomatic efforts, the potential for escalation remains terrifying, including increased strikes against critical infrastructure and capital cities on both sides. That's why it remains a top-tier global concern in the CFR survey.
Now, one massive, perhaps unintended consequence of the administration's disdain for European elites and its treatment of Ukraine has been Europe's awakening to its own defense needs. They realize they cannot rely entirely on a rapidly shifting U.S. strategy.
That realization is driving seismic changes in European defense policy. European leaders have been compelled to take their own security much more seriously. This is exemplified by the NATO allies agreeing to an incredibly ambitious new defense spending pledge of 5% of GDP by 2035 at the Hague Summit. This isn't just incremental growth, this is a transformative shift that recognizes the permanent nature of the Russian threat.
And the analysis from institutions like the SGDSM, the French security body, that confirms that permanent shift in mindset.
Yes. The SGDSN analysis confirms this, stating unequivocally that Russia is the most direct threat today and for years to come, and Europe must take control of its own destiny. That commitment to 5% of GDP represents tens of billions of euros being permanently reallocated toward defense procurement, readiness, and crucially, building an independent deterrent capacity outside of immediate U.S. political whims.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the crisis in Ukraine is happening concurrently with the total collapse of the formal arms control architecture that has governed nuclear risks for decades.
This is arguably the gravest underlying structural threat to global stability that we are examining today. The new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, which is the last binding bilateral arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia, is set to expire on February 5, 2026. Russia has already suspended the treaty, citing noncompliance and refusing to allow critical inspections.
So what does the expiration of New START actually mean? When we talk about the total collapse of arms control, what is the practical impact on strategic security?
It means we lose all transparency and verification. Under New START, Washington and Moscow had limits on deployed warheads and delivery systems, and they had a mutual inspection regime that allowed both sides to know exactly what the other was doing. After February 5th, there will be no limits whatsoever on the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. Both sides can immediately begin increasing their stockpiles, and neither side will have any real insight into the other's activity.
And that lack of predictability leads directly to mistrust and a rise in nuclear saber-rattling.
Precisely. The post-New START outlook is described by security analysts as bleak and ripe for miscalculation. And the risk doesn't stop with the U.S. and Russia. Experts are warning about the significant risk of cascading proliferation, especially in Asia. We are already seeing louder, more mainstream voices in South Korea and Japan discussing the urgent necessity of acquiring their own nuclear deterrent to face off against an expanding China. The strategic predictability that the world relied on for decades is just dissolving. And regional powers are beginning to fill that vacuum with talk of independent nuclear capacity.
Shifting focus now, the Middle East shadow war between Israel and Iran, which has defined the region for years, has intensified into something far more dangerous. We're talking direct confrontation. We're well past the point of simple proxy skirmishes.
That's the consensus. Since 2024, Israel, supported by the U.S. and Iran, have conducted 3 direct exchanges of fire. The sources highlight the major June 2025 strikes, which were launched primarily against Iran's nuclear program. Iran's retaliation was swift and direct, striking a U.S. military base in Qatar. This marks an unambiguous elevation in the nature of regional conflict, where state actors are targeting each other directly.
What's the current status of Iran's nuclear program following those extensive strikes? Is it stalled?
The status is highly undetermined, and that uncertainty is driving major concern. International inspectors' access to Iranian nuclear sites has been curtailed significantly, meaning the global community has limited insight into their work. While Iran acknowledged extensive damage, its officials, including Foreign Minister Abbas Araki, claim they have reconstructed everything that was damaged. The level of Iran's weapons-grade fissile stockpiles is currently unknown, which raises the potential for renewed confrontation if the U.S. or Israel believe the program is too close to a breakout capacity.
And the rhetoric from both Washington and Jerusalem indicates a willingness to strike again if that line is crossed.
Absolutely. Both Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump have explicitly stated that renewed attacks are possible if Iran reestablishes its missile or nuclear programs. Trump explicitly stated that if Iran begins to reconstitute its programs, we're going to have to knock them down. This suggests the military option remains firmly on the table, contributing to regional anxiety.
If the Iranian axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Hamas, others, was meant to be the lever of their regional power, how is that network holding up under all this pressure?
The reports indicate that network is mostly in tatters, which is a major victory for the U.S.-Israeli strategy. Syria's Bashar al-Assad fled in late 2024. Hezbollah is significantly weakened by internal pressure, and Hamas is constrained in Gaza. However, the Houthis in Yemen remain a powerful destabilizing exception.
And the Houthis have demonstrated potent global disruption capabilities, specifically targeting shipping.
They severely disrupted Red Sea commercial shipping throughout 2023-2025 using drones and missiles. Critically, Iran appears to have upped arms deliveries to the Houthis, and the group has deepened ties with the radical militant group Al-Shabaab in Somalia, right across the Red Sea. This linkage means that one group is reinforcing another, amplifying the threat to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a vital choke point for global trade.
On the diplomatic and strategic side, there's a consistent U.S. push to neutralize these groups entirely by getting them to disarm.
That's the core focus of the non-kinetic strategy. The U.S. and its allies are strongly pushing for Iran-backed groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, in Iraq to disarm or be integrated into state forces, placing them under government control.
What are the PMF specifically, for those who don't know?
The PMF are predominantly Shiite, state-sponsored umbrella organizations in Iraq that often operate outside of central government control, but receive funding and, historically, arms from Iran. Integrating them into the official Iraqi security forces would mean cutting that foreign influence and imposing central control. In the case of Hezbollah, the U.S. is even arguing that the capture of Maduro in Venezuela in January 2026 will weaken Hezbollah's Latin American presence, which uses regional drug trafficking networks for income, cutting off a vital funding stream.
The political landscape in the Middle East is rapidly shifting too. The Arab states are rethinking who the primary source of instability actually is, and the focus is broadening beyond Tehran.
This is a major insight from the Chatham House analysis. Arab states no longer view Iran as the sole or even the main source of regional instability. That focus has shifted to explicitly include Israel, particularly following Israeli strikes in sovereign territories, like the strike conducted in Qatar against Hamas leaders. While diplomatic ties established by the 2020 Abraham Accords remain technically in place, they are under severe strain.
And as we touched on earlier, the immediate crisis in Gaza continues to be a powder keg, despite the ceasefire.
It is entirely tenuous. It leaves the core disputes unresolved. The reality is that Palestinians are crowded in horrendous conditions under continued Hamas rule in less than half the Strip. Analysts keep repeating that this unacceptable situation is defensible only as a way station to something better. Until there is a path toward a durable settlement, the instability in Gaza remains a high-risk factor capable of reigniting a broader regional conflict at any moment.
This raises an important question that connects directly back to the NSS priorities. In a world focused on major power competition, U.S. versus Russia, U.S. versus China, what is happening in regions where local conflicts could explode and still drag the world in? Especially if those regions hold resources the U.S. desperately needs. We have to look at Africa.
Africa is certainly represented. It hosts the largest number of contingencies, 9 in the CFR survey, though most are rated as low impact on direct U.S. interests. However, given the NSS focus on economic statecraft and critical minerals, these conflicts take on a new strategic dimension.
Okay, let's start with a rivalry that could tip the Horn of Africa into all-out conflagration: Ethiopia and Eritrea.
This rivalry is extremely dangerous because it is driven by existential state needs. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed seeks to end his country's status as the world's most populous landlocked country, a situation Addis Ababa views as a massive economic vulnerability. Asmara fears that Abiy aims to reconquer Eritrea's ports, which Ethiopia lost after Eritrea's 1993 secession. The rhetoric is escalating, with Ethiopia accusing Eritrea of arming anti-government militias, while Eritrea paints Ethiopia as the aggressor. Both sides have extensively rearmed since the Tigray War, making a new conflict highly kinetic.
What makes this conflict potential so regionally destabilizing, particularly for the U.S., which has an interest in Red Sea security?
The danger is the regionalization of the conflict. A new Ethiopia-Eritrea war could morph into a far wider regional war due to existing proxy linkages. For example, Asmara currently backs the Sudanese army. If war breaks out, Addis Ababa could step up its support for the rival Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, the RSF, dragging the entire region deeper into crisis. This highlights the interconnectedness. A conflict driven by ports threatens to exacerbate another conflict driven by internal political strife.
And the other major African conflict drawing immediate concern is the civil war in Sudan.
The escalation of the civil war in Sudan is rated by experts as the most likely contingency to occur in 2026 among all conflicts surveyed globally. Now, it's rated as Tier 2, high likelihood, low impact on U.S. interests, but this is where that critical minerals connection becomes relevant. The fighting is raging fiercely in Kordofan, leading to further mass atrocities.
And the possibility of talks seems constantly undermined by external forces.
Exactly. The path to talks is compounded by external, non-African dynamics, specifically friction between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These Gulf states back rival sides in Yemen, and that tension spills over into their involvement in Sudan, complicating the obstacles to finding a unified diplomatic solution. So even a low-impact conflict is tied up in major geopolitical rivalries.
Finally, we cannot ignore the ongoing and worsening Sahel crisis in West Africa.
In Mali and Burkina Faso, the risk of regime collapse and further chaos is growing significantly. Jihadists, particularly the al-Qaeda affiliate Jamaat Nasser al-Islam al-Muslimin, or JNIM, have demonstrated a new level of confidence and operational ambition.
And who is JNIM, and what is the significance of their current operations?
JNM is one of the largest and most persistent al-Qaeda affiliates, operating across the Sahel. They have essentially imposed a partial blockade on Mali's capital, Bamako. This is seen as signaling a new, dangerous phase of the war. They are no longer content with rural control. They are squeezing the central military authorities. The SGDSN analysis also notes that the proliferation of crisis hotspots in Africa means that transnational threats like drug trafficking and organized crime are also resurging, benefiting from the collapse of centralized governance.
Now we move to the centerpiece of the U.S. NSS competition with China, which the strategy defines as the essential non-hemispheric theater for American security and economic dominance. China's grand strategy aims for national rejuvenation by the centenary of the People's Republic in 2049.
That strategy is comprehensive and total. Beijing's goal is to raise China's influence, appeal, and power to shape events globally, demanding a world-class military that can fight and win against any adversary, particularly the United States. This national strategy hinges on three core interests that are explicitly non-negotiable, not subject to compromise.
What are those three non-negotiable core interests, and why are they considered sacred by Beijing?
First, the absolute non-negotiable control of the Chinese Communist Party over the state. Second, promoting and sustaining China's economic development. And third, defending and expanding China's sovereignty and territorial claims. And these territorial claims are expansive. They include Taiwan, disputes in the South China Sea, the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, and even the large Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. These form the red line for Beijing's long-term strategy.
The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is clearly focused on achieving that fight-and-win capability. They are revising their military strategic guidelines in response to what they see as a worsening security environment.
And the capabilities they are developing are designed specifically to negate U.S. intervention. U.S. defense analysis suggests that the PLA's kinetic strike capability using missiles, rockets, and air power would probably be effective within 1,500 to 2,000 nautical miles from the Chinese mainland.
What does that 2,000 nautical mile radius practically mean for U.S. strategy?
It means that if the PLA can project sufficient military volume across that radius, it seriously challenges the feasibility of U.S. military involvement in a conflict scenario like Taiwan or the South China Sea. It means U.S. carrier groups, air bases, and logistical hubs like those in Guam or potentially Japan are exposed and highly vulnerable. It's an attempt to establish a regional anti-accessoria denial bubble.
And their nuclear program is undergoing a shocking expansion, moving well beyond traditional levels of minimum deterrence.
We're seeing a significant accelerated expansion of their silo fields across the interior of China. We're talking Hami with 110 silos, Yumen with 120 silos, and Yulin with 90 silos. That's over 300 new hardened silos. To put that in perspective, this expansion shifts China from a minor nuclear power to one approaching parity with the US and Russia. Furthermore, their intercontinental ballistic missiles, the CSS-4 class, have a maximum range of 13,000 kilometers. That means virtually the entire continental United States is now firmly within reach, which shifts the strategic equation entirely, especially in the context of the New START collapse we just discussed.
On the internal front, however, there are signs of instability within the military itself, these extensive corruption investigations.
This is a massive issue. The PLA is experiencing sweeping corruption investigations, leading to the removal of dozens of general officers and reaching the highest levels of the Central Military Commission. This creates a critical paradox for Washington analysts. The corruption risks short-term disruptions to operational effectiveness. After all, if generals are stealing money, they aren't procuring functional equipment. But analysts suggest that if this campaign effectively eliminates deep systemic issues, the PLA could ultimately emerge as a more proficient, more disciplined fighting force in the future.
And globally, the Sino-Russian strategic partnership is deepening, almost certainly driven by a shared interest in countering the United States as the world's sole superpower.
They are supporting each other's defense industrial bases in key ways. Russia is providing advanced technologies and expertise to China, including for highly sophisticated ballistic missile defense and complex nuclear energy projects. In return, China provides crucial dual-use components like semiconductors, sensors, and radars, which are vital for Russia's war effort in Ukraine. Beijing is being careful to stop short of providing lethal aid to mitigate reputational costs, but the strategic value of this trade is enormous for Moscow.
Okay, let's zoom in on Taiwan, which remains the single most volatile point of contention in the region and the focus of the massive military buildup we just discussed. Beijing's rhetoric has intensified, suggesting increasing frustration with the status quo.
That shift in rhetoric in 2025 was a warning sign. Key statements from the Taiwan Affairs Work Conference omitted previous language on the need to promote the peaceful development of cross-strait relations. While the basic official policy remains peaceful unification, the omission suggests a hardening line, indicating Beijing's growing intolerance for Taiwan's political evolution and a shortened timeline for action.
And Beijing is using a sophisticated whole-of-government approach to exert pressure, short of outright war, aimed at wearing down Taiwan's resilience.
That approach is multi-domain and continuous. Diplomatic pressure, aggressive information operations, economic coercion, and constant military pressure. The PLA increased its baseline air and naval presence throughout 2024, routinely crossing the Taiwan Strait centerline, an unofficial delimitation honored by China until 2019.
The military exercises are becoming increasingly explicit about invasion preparation.
They are. The Joint SWORD 2024A and 2024B exercises were particularly critical because they tested a full spectrum of warfighting capabilities. They focused on multi-domain collaboration, joint operational command and control, or C2, seizing maritime and air superiority and blockading key ports. And critically, the China Coast Guard, the CCG, was fully integrated into these military operations for the first time.
Why is the integration of the Coast Guard so significant?
Because it blurs the line between law enforcement and military action. If they were to implement a blockade, Beijing could claim it's a maritime enforcement action, and that complicates the decision for other nations, like the US, on whether to respond with military force. In Joint SWORD 2024B, CCG ships encircled Taiwan for the first time ever, demonstrating an integrated blockade capability that uses civilian-looking assets for strategic military aims.
Despite this overwhelming pressure and demonstrated capability, what are the PLA's actual shortfalls if they were ordered to launch a massive amphibious assault across the strait?
The primary weakness identified by U.S. analysis is the lack of conventional air and maritime lift capacity for a truly large-scale invasion. We're talking about the sheer number of troops and heavy equipment needed. But they are actively trying to mitigate this shortfall by training with civilian roll-off commercial vessels, effectively incorporating dual-use civilian lift into their training exercises to plug that capacity gap and reduce the time needed to prepare for an invasion.
Taiwan, meanwhile, is bolstering its defense using a holistic strategy known as whole-of-society defense resilience.
Yes, the WASTAR strategy is Taiwan's attempt to raise the cost of invasion to an unacceptable level for Beijing. The strategy focuses on civilian training, stockpiling critical materials, securing infrastructure, and bolstering medical and communication networks. They have an ambitious goal to train 400,000 citizens to contribute to this societal resilience. Furthermore, they are extending mandatory military conscription from 4 months to 1 year for some conscripts who will receive more extensive training, including on advanced systems like Stinger anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles.
Beyond Taiwan, China is steadily expanding its global reach, particularly through overseas basing and the use of hybrid threats.
Their military footprint is growing in strategic locations. While the existing operational base in Djibouti is mainly used for military diplomacy, in April 2025, the Joint Logistics and Training Center was inaugurated at Ream Naval Base in Cambodia. While China and Cambodia officially deny the ability to station PLA forces there permanently, the PLA continuously stationed 2 naval combatants there prior to the official opening, demonstrating a functional presence.
Where else is China interested in establishing access points, and what is the strategic driver?
The necessity to protect their global interests is the driver. They are interested in bases along key sea longs of communication, the SLOCs, specifically the Malacca Strait and the Strait of Hormuz. They are actively considering basing options in numerous countries, including Pakistan, the UAE, Tanzania, Kenya, and even Cuba, all locations that provide strategic access to vital trade routes and potential forward positions against the U.S.
In the non-kinetic domains, China remains the most persistent cyber threat to the U.S., demonstrating the hybrid nature of this competition.
The assessment is unequivocal. Throughout 2024, China-linked cyber intrusions increased by a staggering 150% across all sectors compared to 2023. PLA cyber actors are actively developing capabilities designed to disrupt U.S. defense and civilian critical infrastructure, things like power grids, transportation, and communications in the event of a crisis or conflict. This is preparatory work for warfighting.
And we're seeing advanced influence operations involving artificial intelligence that blur the lines between state propaganda and digital crime.
That's the hallmark of their influence efforts. The online influence operation known as Spamouflage, which is linked to China's Ministry of Public Security, uses inauthentic social media and AI-generated content to sow political chaos. A deeply concerning example cited is the use of a deepfake video of Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. talking about illicit drugs, deployed specifically to undermine his political support following his defiant efforts in the South China Sea. This manipulation shows how readily they will use technology to destabilize governments that oppose their territorial claims.
So what does this all mean? We've covered everything from the deployment of a U.S. carrier group off Venezuela to PLA silos in the Gobi Desert. We've seen a clear shift from the old international order, defined by institutions and rules, to one where major powers are defining new spheres of influence, and unilateral force is becoming alarmingly normalized.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most striking takeaway is the simultaneous lawlessness we see from Washington threatening conquest in Greenland and Panama, ordering illegal strikes in the Caribbean, and the increasing adventurism from rivals who may see this as a green light. The foundational structures of global stability are undeniably eroding, leading to this pervasive increase in global disorder. Because when the rulemaker breaks the rules, everyone else feels justified doing the same.
And for you, the learner, understanding this shift means recognizing that the conflicts of 2026 are highly, though sometimes subtly, interconnected. We talked about the NSS focus on economic statecraft and the U.S. reliance on critical minerals. That focus links seemingly disparate conflicts, like the civil war in Sudan or the crisis in the Sahel, directly to core U.S. economic interests in securing supply chains. It transforms what might otherwise be viewed as regional instability into a matter of national strategic concern.
And this anxiety is not limited to conflicts abroad. The CFR Preventive Priorities Survey results reflect a deeply unsettling truth. 28 out of 30 surveyed contingencies were judged to be highly or moderately likely to occur. But the most enduring, most disturbing anxiety reflected in the highest rankings is this. For the third year running, experts rated political violence and instability in the U.S. itself as a high likelihood, high impact concern. That's a previously unimaginable inclusion in a global conflict survey that is traditionally focused on foreign wars and terrorist attacks.
That domestic instability combined with global lawlessness is the defining feature of 2026. We've discussed the collapse of the New START Treaty, which means that by February 5th, 2026, there will be no limits or transparency on the world's 2 largest nuclear arsenals. Given that the U.S. is prioritizing China and Russia is focusing its deterrence against Europe, the absence of binding arms control means that the strategic dialogue between Washington and Moscow is far below the levels of the last 50 years. The final thought we leave you with is this. How will the world manage the escalation risk when the established mechanisms for strategic predictability, the very lines of communication that prevented accidental nuclear war between the two largest nuclear powers, cease to exist?